But yeah, I want David to introduce himself first. But again, just wanted to say how good of a friend he has been to our community. And if you don't know, he's a clinical psychologist, ordained Zen Buddhist priest, and works down in South Austin. And so I love connecting. Follow him on Twitter. That's where I think he's most active on social media, Dr. David Z. And I'll let you introduce yourself and I'll turn my video off so that we can focus on your talk.
Sure. Okay.
Yeah, thanks,
Sounds
guys.
great. All right. Hey, well, first, I do want to say thank you to my good friend, Reverend Aurelia. I want to say thank you to everybody at Peace of Christ Church. And I'm playing with the technology here. I just want to thank everybody for coming out. I realize, too, that we're in strange and complicated times. And so I'm glad to be with you all virtually via this webinar and to talk about one of my very favorite subjects, which is Zen Buddhism. And confronting the reality of suffering in our world and also trying to find joy amidst that. So as we begin our talk, I'd like to read a poem. And let's see, pulling the poem up, excuse me. Before I read this poem, to kind of contextualize it, it's written by a gentleman named John Snyder. He was a Zen teacher and a poet, and he wrote this poem. It's entitled Waves. And he wrote this poem as he was dying and also living fully with Lou Gehrig's disease. He died a couple years ago. And this poem is called Waves. And it illustrates a lot of the ideas that I hope to talk about tonight, specifically the nature of existence and how to overcome suffering. So this is Waves. What is the shape of a wave? That is my shape. A brief swelling on the surface. My deepest thoughts, my care, my projects, all spindrift in the wind. Do not say that I came into the world, lived a little while, and returned to my source. See the wind-driven froth for what it is. Dive deep. Say instead, no world to enter, no one to enter it, no life to live, no death to die, no source to leave or return to. Say I am the ocean, taking the shape of a wave, surrounded by limitless waves, swelling out of that great wave, the tide, incalculable power, breathing in, breathing out, forever. This is Waves by John Snyder. And so I want to thank y'all for being here. And what we're talking about today is, the title of my talk is a Zen approach to transforming suffering and cultivating joy. As we begin too, I want to say, so I've done a lot of stuff with Reverend Aurelia and Peace of Christ Church over the years. I think they do a great job working for social justice and inclusivity on a range of fronts and engaged spirituality and a lot of interreligious dialogue, like having me, a Zen Buddhist priest here. So, and I say that because I've done a lot of stuff with Peace of Christ Church over the years. They know me really well. I have some friends from Harvard Divinity School and stuff on the line. Great to see everybody. So some of you know that in Zen Buddhism, it's very traditional to shave our heads. And the reason we do that in Zen, when you're ordained, you're a monk or you're a nun, you're ordained, is because we shave our heads as a ritualistic way to cultivate equanimity and acceptance with things we cannot change. And so, you know, I was ordained as a Zen Buddhist priest, I guess in 2005. There's what's called in traditional kind of Asian Zen, Shramana and Bhikkhu ordination. Shramana is kind of the novice ordination. Bhikkhu is kind of like an abbot of a monastery or something, kind of master ordination. And I've done both. When you first get ordained, you shave your head. And so my kids have never known me without a shaved head. And Peace of Christ Church has never known me, I think, without a shaved head. And so my daughters would always be like, Dad, because they were born after I was ordained, so they've only known a bald-headed dad. And my daughters were always like, Dad, when are you going to grow your hair out? And I'm like, I'm a Zen priest. This is the way my existence is. We must cultivate equanimity with my bald head. And my daughter's like, come on, shave your head. I'm like, nope, this is not the path. My path is baldness. And they were like, well, would you ever, you know, they're like, Dad, the essence of Zen is everything changes. Would you ever, let your hair grow out? And I'm like, well, in theory, because that is the essence of Zen, is that everything changes. So never say never, but no, I'm never going to shave. I'm never going to stop shaving my head. And I did say to my daughters, I'm like, it would take something really crazy for me to let my hair grow out. And now we have a pandemic, so my hair is growing out. So I try not to have attachment to the way I've gotten used to my head being bald. And so now I'm cultivating equanimity with hair, which is a strange thing for me. So, and that's a little bit, I think, about, having a bald head, cultivating equanimity with things that are beyond our control is kind of what this whole talk is about. And so this talk, I do want to say right off the bat, the title of my talk, I actually, when Aurelia and I were planning this talk, we were kind of coming up with different names, and I came up with the idea of transforming suffering and cultivating joy, which is in a sense kind of like a very standard Zen thing to do, to talk about cultivating joy. And I'll say up front, I came up with the title of that talk, so I have no one else to blame, but there's a part of me that doesn't like the title of the talk, which I came up with, I admit. It's not that Buddhism definitely focuses on the idea of transforming suffering. I mean, you could say that transforming suffering is kind of the essence of what Buddhism is all about. And it's not that joy is a bad thing in a Buddhist context. Joy is a great thing. I have lots of things that I'm joyful about. I think cultivating joy is a very skillful practice. I think sometimes, maybe even in American society, I'll say that we need to be careful about how we use the term joy. It's not that joy is a bad thing, but sometimes we use the term joy in a way of kind of a lightness, which isn't bad either, but a kind of a shallowness. I'm not talking about sensory level pleasures, which are fine, like you have a delicious treat or something you enjoy. I'm not talking about just fun in the moment, though that's also a great thing too. What I'm talking about is the deep, abiding, meaningful, purpose-based joy. And I think that's an important distinction, because I really believe, and I'll say this as a Zen priest, and I'll say this as a clinical psychologist, that if you look at people who've really lived actualized lives, who've changed the world, the Dalai Lama, Martin Luther King, Mother Teresa, Rosa Parks, Maya Angelou, artists, spiritual teachers, mental health workers, social justice workers. If you really look at the people who made the world the way it is in a good way, they often weren't always happy. They weren't always light 100% of the time. Sometimes they might have had profound sadness or profound difficulty. In the mythology of Buddhism, it's said that the whole reason that the Buddha created the Four Noble Truths, the Eightfold Path, mindfulness meditation, Buddhism as a system, was because he himself, the historical being Siddhartha Gautama, was afraid of the fact that he would someday get sick, someday and continuously age, and he would eventually die. The inevitability and universality of change to the historical Buddha himself was terrifying. And I think that's an important point, because it's okay to be sad. It's okay to be afraid. It's actually quite normal and sometimes quite rational. The key is we don't want to get stuck in our fear, or stuck in our pain, or stuck in our difficulty. And I think that if you look at any spiritual tradition, in my opinion, like Jesus of the New Testament, if you look at the Passion narrative, Jesus wept in the Garden of Gethsemane. Jesus felt alone. Jesus felt betrayed. Even on the cross, he cried out, my God, why have you forsaken me?" Now, he also found transformation, but he had that great difficulty too. And I really believe, and I can say as a psychologist with firm conviction, that if you look at even the most enlightened, wisest, kind of societal change makers, they have often had profound trauma, grief, or difficulty in their lives. And often that profound grief, difficulty, or trauma was the very thing that helped move them further along their path. So I think we need to be, I like the term joy and I came up with it, but I also think we need to be a little careful with it, not to just throw it around. To give another kind of analogy around that, and this is another key idea in Buddhist philosophy, and you'll hear this a fair amount in mental health care too, but it's the distinction between pain and suffering. Um, in a similar note to what I was just saying, we're all going to have pain sometimes. The first noble truth is that life contains pain. Um, we all get older, we all get sick, we are all of the nature to die. And that's not being defeatist. We can never overcome a challenge until we face that challenge directly. And there will be pain in human existence. Sometimes, the more good you're doing in the world, like if you're doing a lot of social justice work, fighting against racism, fighting against sexism, fighting against homophobia, this kind of stuff, peacemaking work, you're going to encounter profound difficulty. It's not that we're masochists. We don't want to thrust suffering upon ourselves. But if you just look back on the scope of your own life, if you look back on the things that are the most meaningful for you, whatever those things are, my hunch would be you probably will discover that some of the most important, meaningful, and deeply abiding, profoundly enriching experiences of your life were often everybody would do it. So it's not that we want to immerse ourselves in pain, but pain is endemic, ubiquitous to the human condition. And the difference, and this is a key point, between pain and suffering, everyone will experience pain. Suffering is a little different. Suffering is when we cling to things that cause us to suffer more. Like you're on your path, being a parent, being a mental health worker, being, working in a hospital, working on the front lines of the COVID pandemic. Whatever you're doing, whatever is meaningful in your life, you will probably experience great difficulty in it. But suffering is when we cling to things in a way that causes us to have even more difficulty. Maybe we cling to thought patterns, behavioral patterns, interpersonal patterns, emotional patterns, but we cling to things that gets us off our meaningful path, that gets us waylaid, that makes our pain more. That's the difference between pain and suffering. And so when we think about Buddhism and we think about transforming suffering, one of the central ideas, y'all have probably heard this before, is what we call the Four Noble Truths. And I'll say this briefly, probably a lot of y'all are familiar with it, but the first is that the Buddha said, and I'll kind of run through these and then elaborate. The first noble truth of Buddhism is what we would say is the truth of suffering, or life is suffering. The second noble truth, it gets translated a little differently, but basically, suffering comes from desire. The third noble truth is that desire or suffering can be overcome. And the fourth noble truth is the path itself to overcome suffering. So let me elaborate on those, especially if you're not familiar with them. They might sound a little daunting. I grew up in the West, I grew up in the South. I was not raised as a Buddhist. I was always real interested in Buddhism, even as a kid. Went to Harvard Divinity School, studied Buddhism formally, then in Asia. But when I first started hearing, I was always real interested in Buddhism, interested in meditation, seemed like a cool thing, and then when I started studying Buddhism and you come in contact with the Four Noble Truths, life is suffering. Ugh. Suffering comes from desire. What? That sounds depressing. So let me say right up front, as a clinical psychologist, although I never met the Buddha, the person we call the historical Buddha, I think we do have all Buddha nature, but the Buddha wasn't depressed. He wasn't dysthymic. He wasn't bipolar. He wasn't any of those things. What he sought to be was a scientist studying the human condition. And when he said, life is suffering, it's not that he was being negative. It was not that he was being a downer. The term Buddha, it's a Sanskrit word. The root of that term Buddha, Bud, it literally means to awaken. So a Buddha, if you were to ask, what is a Buddha is someone who is awakened to the true nature of reality. That's what a Buddha is from the perspective of Buddhism. And by the way, anyone can be a Buddha. We all have Buddha nature. We all have the ability to awaken to the true nature of reality. It's not just any one person, it's in all of us all the time, over and over again. If we stray from our path, we can always come back. So, the Buddha was actually being optimistic. And the idea is that we can face the most difficult, hard, seemingly incomprehensible things, and we can overcome them. There might be immense pain, there might be immense difficulty, but we don't have to stay stuck forever. We can move through it and we can overcome, and we can be in the world in a way that's congruent with our goals and our values and our meaning and our purpose. So in psychology, we talk a lot about avoiding things. And when we engage in avoidance behavior, we often make things worse. And so the Buddha had the courage to say, humanity can do this. We can face our suffering directly and we can overcome our difficulty. Now, the second noble truth is a big one. Suffering comes from desire. What the heck does that mean? I think as like a Western Dave growing up in the South, that was crazy to me. Suffering comes from desire. So let me say this right up front, and Aurelia knows me really well. We hang out. I like all kinds of things. You know, I live in South Austin. I like jazz and blues. I like Tex-Mex and like queso and chips, probably a little too much. I like all kinds of things. Suffering comes from desire. It doesn't mean you don't like things. It doesn't mean you don't love things. What we're talking about, and in the nature of desire and suffering from a Buddhist perspective, is we don't want to cling to things in a way that causes us suffering. Kind of like in that poem Waves by John Snyder. Subtly, but again and again, John is saying the idea that everything changes, which is a central idea of Zen. So I'll use myself as an example. In my order, I was ordained in South Korea. In my order of Zen, we're allowed to be married. We're like Protestant Buddhists. You can be fully married, have kids, and be fully ordained. I love my wife. I love my kids. I love South Austin. I love my house. I have a lot of gratitude for all the things I have. I'm talking to you right now from my study and my house. I love my study. I have lots of things that I love. And everything changes. My body is changing. My study is changing. I have kids. They're changing. I'm changing. I have a wife. We've been together for over 20 years. My wife is changing. I'm changing. The nature of our love is changing. You know, to deepen love is to still change in love. Everything about us is constantly changing. I'm growing hair when I was used to being a bald-headed Zen priest, you know? And if we resist the way that life will inevitably change, if we cling to things in a way that causes us not to be in the world in a way that we need to be in the world, that's where we have suffering. So suffering from a Buddhist perspective comes from desiring things to be different than they actually are. Now, let's be clear. There are certain things that are not okay. Racism, not okay. Homophobia, not okay. Sexism, not okay. This isn't saying that the status quo is okay. We're not engaging in abusive behavior and abusive relationships, but there are certain universal existential changes in human existence: aging, sickness, death, impermanence, and even grief. Even in life, we will have grief. Part of the reason we grieve is because we love so deeply, because we had the courage to love. It's not that we want to grieve, but we grieve because we had something that was so meaningful in the first place. But when we resist the inevitable change that comes for all of us in human existence, when we can't be with things the way they are, that's where suffering comes in. So you can enjoy things, like I enjoy living in South Austin, or I enjoy my wife and kids, but everything in life changes. And if I cling to things in a way that is at variance with how they will inevitably change, then I will probably suffer. And so one of the things Buddhism is focusing on is learning to cultivate, and we'll talk about this more in just a second, but equanimity and acceptance with the way life is. And that's a big term, acceptance. We're going to come back to that in just a second. The third noble truth is desire and suffering can be overcome. Again, a profoundly optimistic statement by the Buddha. And that's profound. We're in a pandemic right now. There's a lot of suffering in the world. I'm willing to bet, and I'm making a little assumption, but I'm thinking probably every single person who logged in today is having some difficulty right now in a way that they weren't 3 months ago. I mean, this is a scary time. And the Buddha suggests that even the deepest suffering can be overcome. Now, the next thing, the fourth noble truth, is the path to overcome suffering. Now, to be fair, in Buddhism, there's different ways that the path of suffering gets overcome. You'll see that in different meditation techniques, different styles of the way we convey the Buddha's path. One is the Eightfold Path, which is also really great. Not going to talk about that as much today. Instead, I'm going to talk about what we call the three jewels of Buddhism. And so this is kind of, like in Judaism, Islam, Christianity, you have denominational differences. Same in Buddhism. You have different conceptions of the path. One thing that's kind of universal, which we're going to talk about in just a second, is the idea of the three noble truths. The first thing I want to say is if you're going to overcome suffering, we have to ask, what is the most important thing? I'll give you a quick story of this. When I was first ordained in South Korea, I'll never forget this. So I was ordained in a temple complex called Sanamsa, which is kind of the Vatican of Korean Zen. It's a very famous temple. It was built in 496 of the Common Era, and it's exactly what you'd imagine a Korean temple to look like, in the remote, deep mountains of South Korea. It was in the South Chola province. Anyways, and I was training in a temple called Chilchon-Sunwan, which is about 1,000 years old. I was really honored studying meditation in this temple. And one day, I guess I was in my 30s at this point, and early 30s, and a monk came in, and he was in his late 70s, and he was one of my meditation teachers, and he's like, Dale is my monastic name. He said, he wanted me to clean the temple. Now, you also have to realize this is like a classic Zen trope, right? Like the old monk, the young monk, or monk to be. I was a Hainja, I wasn't ordained yet. The monk gets, the aspiring monk, me, gets an assignment. He's like, I want you to clean the temple. And there's like a bucket of water, and there's like a duster, and there's, a mop, and there's a broom, and there's like scrubbing rags. And he's like, I want you to clean the temple. So I'm like, all right, I'm going to clean the temple. And it's not a big temple. I mean, the temple's 1,000 years old, and it's tiny. It's basically got a little altar, and it's got some meditation cushions, and then it's got a stone floor indoors. Very primitive temple, and he's like, clean the temple. And for just a second, I was like, what do I do? Don't mess up. I had my monkey mind. My automatic thoughts started rolling in, right? And then I was like, okay, I'll start in the upper right corner near the entrance, and I'll move systematically down, tile by tile, front to back, right to left. So I clean everything, and I took some breaths, calm myself, mindfully cleaning the tile, mindfully drying the tile, right? Being fully present, being a good Buddhist, cleaning the tile. A couple hours later, the monk comes in. He's like, Dale, you did a good job. I'm like, thanks. And I'm thinking, I did do a good job. And he's like, tell me how you clean the temple. And I'm like, well, and I explain the process, start in the upper right-hand corner, get down on my hands and knees, present, keep bringing my mind back, subject of meditation, cleaning the floor. Anything can be a subject of meditation. I'm cleaning the floor, meditation, cleaning the tiles, drying the tiles, moving systematically down the tiles in the temple, right? He goes, that was very good. And I'm like, thanks. And he's like, you worked very hard. I'm like, I did work very hard. He's like, you're very organized. I was very organized. And he goes, what's the most important part of the temple? The altar. What did you not clean? The altar. So everybody makes mistakes. And he looks right at me and he goes, there will never be enough time for everything. Always try to do the most important thing. And so, right now, during the COVID pandemic, or any time in your life, ask yourself, what is the most important thing? In psychology, with my clients, I call it the death test. And the death test may sound odd or strange, but I think especially in American society, we can be death denying. And that denyingness causes us suffering. And so one of the fruits of being mortal beings, if I may, one of the fruits of that is that it forces us to ask, how do we want to live our life? What is the most important thing? I've spent, except when I was in grad school, the entirety of my career pretty much working in end-stage oncology, palliative care, and hospice care, with children, with adults, working in end-of-life care. And inevitably, work with Republicans, Democrats, liberal, progressive, Southerner, Northerner, white, black, rich, poor, whoever you are. I can say with a high degree of certainty, when people are on their deathbeds, the vast majority of times they think about their spirituality, their values, their family, and their purpose. That's largely it, And so how do we spend our time? What's really important in the end? What are the most important things? If you want to overcome your difficulty, if you want to cultivate true joy, ask yourself, what are the most important things and how am I living my life right now? What's skillful for me and what gets in the way of how I want to live my life right now? What is the most important thing? And I also want to talk a little bit about what we call the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha. This is a very key phrase in Buddhism. And I think, and I hope I'm not engaging in cultural appropriation. I'll trust my friend Aurelia to call me out if I am. She's good. She's extremely knowledgeable on inclusivity and does a lot of good work in the community. But I do think Buddha, Dharma, Sangha, it's not that you have to be a Buddhist. It's not that you have to follow Buddhist teaching. By the way, the Buddha was always very clear. He said, if you like, try it and see. Find what works for you. We can cling even to Buddhism too much. What is skillful for you for how you want to be in the world? For example, and I say this with utter sincerity, I learn a lot from Peace of Christ Church and from other churches or synagogues or mosques or humanistic communities. Anything can be our teacher. And that actually brings us to the first of the three jewels, the Buddha. Buddha, Dharma, Sangha. Buddha means teacher in a way, and Buddha, Dharma, Sangha. And so here's the thing. We all need teachers to help us overcome our difficulty and to help us find our way. I will say that for myself as well. No matter who you are, no matter how wise or educated or learned or experienced or seasoned, we all need teachers. Now, these teachers aren't mutually exclusive. I have a Zen teacher, Bapyan Sanim, in South Korea. I have other monks who are senior to me or wiser than me. My wife is my teacher. My kids are teacher. We have a dog and two cats. They are my teacher. I'm a psychologist. My patients are my teachers. I read poets like Maya Angelou or Zen teachers like Shunryu Suzuki. They too are my teachers. Everything can be your teachers. Teachers don't have to be exclusive. In fact, if teachers are exclusive, I get a little concerned. But we all need teachers. We all need guides. And that's not a sign of weakness, by the way. That's a sign of strength. Asking for help, seeking out the comfort of others is a sign of strength, not weakness. So the first thing is we need teachers. Buddha, Dharma, Sangha, the three jewels, we need teachers. The second thing is Dharma. Now, I love Dharma. Dharma in Sanskrit, it literally means holding. I love that. So when we say Dharma, from a Buddhist perspective, we're saying we're holding the essence of the Buddha's teaching. Now, Dharma in Buddhist philosophy means two things. So it's kind of like you got 1, 2, 3, and then 2 is like 2 and 2.5. You got two things under Dharma. So in the three jewels, it's kind of like you have like 3.5 things or something. Dharma means holding. So you kind of have the essence of Buddhism. The first thing in Dharma is teaching or philosophy. It's the ideas of Buddhism or whatever tradition, a theology in Christianity, the Torah in Judaism. You have the teachings of the tradition. And I do think in the United States or in the West in general, we kind of focus on this one a lot. We're like, what do you believe? What do I believe? How similar are those? How different are those? Or my beliefs are right, your beliefs are wrong. We get all caught up in beliefs. And beliefs are not bad. We all need some kind of philosophical template. I don't think it has to be religion, by the way, and I say that as an ordained Zen Buddhist priest. Religion's great if that's the thing for you. What's the skillful thing for you? That's the question. But we all need, in psychology, we might call this cognitive schemas or core beliefs, or just philosophy. We all need some system by which we understand the world, in a world where there is inequality, in a world where there is violence, in a world where there is a virus that can spread all over the world and upend our way of life very quickly. We need some type of system that makes sense of the world. Little personal sharing for me, that's largely Zen Buddhism and existential and humanistic psychology, I would say, are kind of my things. Those are my things. What are your things? Right? So we have, and they don't have to be mutually exclusive. I'll say this for myself. I'm Zen Buddhist. I was raised Christian in the South back in the 70s. And I can definitely say being raised Christian, or I've done the month of Ramadan with a good friend of mine who is Muslim. I've done a lot of partnership with synagogues in town. Like, studying other religions has also, I think, made me a better Buddhist, So we can learn from a multiplicity of things to enrich our own philosophy, but we all need some kind of philosophical template that makes sense for us and to how we understand the world. Extremely important. But here's the thing. As important as that cognitive schema is, we need something that's, I don't like to set up hierarchies, but maybe even more important, which is practices. And this is the other part of Dharma. We need practices to make our beliefs and our philosophy a lived, experiential reality. And that's very key. Everybody has ideas, and ideas are great. But I bet all of you have met somebody who's the real deal, who walks the walk. Perfect. Everybody makes mistakes, but they're living the path. And that's what I'm talking about. In psychology terms, what are the behaviors that make your ideas a lived, experiential reality? Doesn't mean you're perfect. We all make mistakes. But what helps you stay on your skillful path? And then we have teachers. We have philosophy. We have the practice that makes our philosophy a lived, experiential reality. And then the other thing we have is Sangha. Sangha is a Sanskrit word. It means community. And this is really interesting. Interestingly enough, the Buddha, in what's called the Pali Canon, is kind of the Old Testament, if you will, of Buddhism. It's kind of the oldest collection of texts that we still have in existence. It's said to be, the actual words of the Buddha. That's actually, I think, a little historically debatable, if I have to be honest about that. But it is good stuff. It's ancient stuff. It's what endures today. And that's cool, right? This is the in reality, this is existence the way it is. Whether or not it was the actual words of the Buddha, is it skillful or not? That's all that matters. Does it help you be in the world the way you want to be in the world or not? And so Sangha, in the Pali Canon, the Buddha said that the Sangha, the community, Sangha means community, the community is the most important part of your spiritual path. And that's powerful, we all need community. No person is an island. We all need support. And so that community can come in many forms. Maybe it's your church, maybe it's your synagogue, maybe it's your mosque, maybe it's your Buddhist synagogue, your Hindu temple, maybe it's your writing group, your running group, your Dungeons and Dragons group. Be playful. Maybe it's group therapy. There's not a limit on communities. You can engage in a multiplicity of communities. Now, I will say right now we're in a pandemic and it's highly contagious, and we do need physical distancing to keep ourselves safe. And it's kind of like the Buddhist idea of interdependence. We all have to rely on each other. Our actions matter. What we do impacts other sentient beings, seen and unseen. So we have to be creative in how we create communities right now. We need each other as a species. For the moment, we can't be together in the same ways that we have. So, hey, giving another shout out to my friends at Peace of Christ Church for making webinars like this happen, bringing people together from all over the country. This is great. We need to find creative ways to be in community together. Maybe you do COVID socialization parties where you go outside and you all say 6 feet apart. Maybe we live stream meditation groups or church groups, that kind of stuff. We find creative ways to stay interconnected in meaningful ways. And so just to review the kind of formula for Buddhism, the path, if you will, is Buddha, Dharma, and Sangha. We need teachers. That's the Buddha idea, right? Guides. Dharma. We need philosophy, cognitions, coupled with practices. What do we actually do in our real life? In Buddhism, the big thing is meditation. All kinds of different meditations. Mindfulness meditation, loving kindness meditation, koan meditation, chanting meditation, walking meditation. Anything can be a vehicle of meditation, by the way. All meditation is, in a sense, is putting your thoughts and emotions on things that are skillful for how you want to be in the world. Maybe it's contemplative prayer. Maybe it's journaling. Maybe it's exercise. We hold stress and tension in our bodies. Exercise can be incredibly powerful psychologically and spiritually. But we all need philosophy, cognitions, cognitive schema beliefs, and then we need practices to make that philosophy a lived experiential reality. And then we need community. We need community. Now, that may look different for each and every one of us, but community is important too. And I think that's one of the things that makes the pandemic so hard right now, is that we have to find new ways for the time being to be in community with each other. There's a lot of things that we can keep talking about. The one thing I do want to open it up for question and answers and have plenty of time for that. But I do want to offer one other note. This comes up a lot when I give talks on Buddhism and suffering, and transforming suffering, and and cultivating joy. And what I would say is, a lot of people talk about the question of hope. And from a Buddhist perspective, hope is a complicated thing. I'm not saying hope is bad. As a psychologist, I think hope can be very, very good, but we do want to be careful with hope. Sometimes hope from a Buddhist perspective is we take ourselves outside of the present moment, and sometimes if we're not careful, we can have kind of pie in the sky, unrealistic kind of fantasy, seeking of wish fulfillment type stuff. And you see that right now in the pandemic. People will say, oh, we've got everything under control. There are good things happening in our society. This is, going to wrap up right away. Um, the truth is that the pandemic may be with us for a while, and it's going to be a challenge, I think, for a little while. Um, in Buddhism, the closest analog you have in Sanskrit to the idea of hope or even faith, there's a Sanskrit term called shraddha, S-R-A-D-D-H-A, kind of a long A sound. And that really more translates to confidence based on the evidence. It's kind of an empiricism. And so we have confidence based on the evidence, if that makes sense. So it's not just kind of saying, I wish the world was this way, and then hoping that works out. It says, what is the data? What is skillful for us? How do we want the world to be? And how can we get there? So like when I'm with a client, I'll often say, well, let's see, you're sleeping better, you're exercising, you're having more skillful thoughts, you're being in the world in a way that you want to be in the world. I have confidence based on the evidence in you, in that you're changing your life. And does that make sense? It's a complicated idea, but and I'm not saying hope is bad, but I think from the Buddhist perspective, we always like to say, what is the data? What is the evidence? And I will say, I've worked in end-of-life care with grief and trauma for over 20 years now, with all kinds of different folks, Republicans, Democrats, rich, poor, conservative, liberal. And I do think, we say in Buddhism that we all have Buddha nature. And what that means is we all have the potential to transform our lives and to find goodness and meaning in our lives. And I've been kind of intentional about the work I do, hospice work, palliative care, end-stage oncology. And I have to say, the reason I do this work is because I find it profoundly meaningful. And, sometimes in our society, we can get really divided. I myself have strong political views. I think I'm right, but as we all do, right? But I do believe working amidst deep suffering, when people are having the most difficulty in their lives, it actually makes me feel optimistic about the human condition. Because I think ultimately we do have Buddha nature. And I think there's a lot more that sometimes we may have some delusions, sometimes we may have some unskillful behaviors, myself included, but I think there's more that connects us than divides us. And I have confidence based on the evidence that we can transform our suffering and find our way, even through the greatest difficulty, times such as these, that we can find our way and move forward in a purposeful, meaningful way. And I'm very grateful to be here with all of you. And we still have a lot of time for Q&A, and I'm looking at my friend Aurelia, and she said, feel free to submit your questions under the Q&A tab, and I think people are doing that. And I think there's a Q&A here. Do you want to jump on, Aurelia?
Can you see it in your tab?
I think I see first a person, Tammy Fuller, and then there might also be another. There's Joe Virgil. Awesome. Hey, Joe. So I'm going to click on Joe's thing in just a second. Everybody submit your questions. Make me get my exercise. I need it. The first one I think came from Tammy Fuller. Thank you, Tammy. I read Thich Nhat Hanh's book, Jesus and the Buddha. Nice. Very good. Super affirming. I'm quoting Tammy here, and it is very good and super affirming. Are there any books that you can be more practical for us in terms of guidance and some intersectionality and practice? Yes. And I'm in my study. Well, there's two that I would recommend. One is my very favorite. It's called Mindfulness in Plain English by Bhante Gunaratna. Gunaratna, that's a mouthful, but it's spelled just like it sounds. Gun, G-U-N, Aratna, A-R-R-A-T-N-A. Gunaratna. If you just Google mindfulness in plain English, Bhante G, it'll come right up. And, John Kabat-Zinn, who's a neurologist from MIT, who kind of helped bring mindfulness into like biological medicine and then psychology. He got a lot of his ideas of mindfulness from Bhante Gunaratna's book. It's an incredible book. It's what it says, mindfulness in plain English. How do you learn mindfulness meditation? In plain English. It's an awesome, awesome book. The other book, and I have it somewhere. I've got it right here. So another book I like, and I use with some of my own patients, and I've even used it in my own life. I'm going to hold it up here to the camera. It has kind of a new agey title, but it's still awesome. Don't let that scare you. It's called Get Out of Your Mind and Into Your Life by Stephen Hayes, a clinical psychologist. So he uses what's called, and I'll put this up again, Get Out of Your Mind and Into Your Life, Stephen Hayes, and it's the new acceptance and commitment therapy. It's actually been out since the 90s, but it's a very acceptance and commitment therapy, or ACT. It's actually a variation of what we call cognitive behavioral therapy, very research-based, super sound. I'm going to be honest with y'all. I've studied ACT a lot. I like ACT. I use it in my own life. I use it with my clients, taught some of it to my kids, good stuff. I would say that ACT is basically Buddhism and spirituality in general, but definitely Buddhism. Ecology form. But I love this book. It's also a book on tape. I have it on tape, and I have just the old school paper version. I would get the paper version because it has lots of good exercises that you can do, and it's kind of like cheap therapy, $20 for a book, and it's very research-based, very, very practical. So yeah, I think Aurelia already bought it. Good for you, Aurelia. So other questions, and I'm going to click on my friend Jo Virgil, who's a poet and published writer. Check out her stuff. Hey, Jo. Jo says, powerful talk, thank you. One of my helpful approaches comes from Pema Chodron. Yeah, can't go wrong with Pema Chodron. Especially right now in the times of the pandemic, Pema Chodron is, she's a Tibetan Buddhist nun, a Westerner, very skillful, I believe. She writes a lot on suffering in very practical ways. So Jo Virgil says, one of my helpful approaches comes from Pema Chodron. Be curious. That helps me focus on what I can learn from tough times and good times. What are your thoughts on that? Jo, that's so great. I feel like we need a whole nother talk on be curious. But one way I think of be curious, I think that's a great point, Jo. Thank you. Is we want to be careful of attachments to our ego, and we can all slip into this, myself included. But we can say, I got it all figured out. I'm very serious, Buddhist practitioner. Or I'm, this eminent Christian, monk or Buddhist monk. No matter who we are, we all make mistakes, myself included. We all stray from the path, and we need to come back to the path. So be curious, to me, says, overcome your attachments to your ego. Don't get cocky. Don't get stuck in attachments for how you are. Also, be curious. Slow down. Learn to appreciate the subtle things in human existence. I'll look at my own little personal sharing real quick. I grew up in the South. I grew up in a military family. I grew up in a very military family. Personal sharing. My dad flew F-4s in Vietnam. I had an uncle who was a real Navy SEAL in Vietnam. I grew up in a very Southern military, conservative, upbringing, which I'm grateful for, because I may not share everything from my family cultural of origin, but it helps me relate to other people, and it helps me be less judgmental. And we're all interconnected. And I can see how I could have gone a different way. The causes and conditions of my life just happened to play out in this way. So I always want to be curious with life. I want to be, I think the poet Mary Oliver said, a bridegroom married to amazement. The best things in my life were always surprises. The fact that I would eventually grow up to be a bald-headed Buddhist monk in South Korea, that was crazy. I never would have done that, or moved to Texas. No offense, Texas is great, but I grew up on the East Coast. I never thought I'd live in Texas. Texas is great. I think that a lot of times when we allow ourselves to be curious, to be surprised, to be open to the change and mystery of existence, is when we really find our way. So thank you, Joe. That's incredibly powerful. Yeah, thank you for that. Reverend Matt from Peace of Christ Church. I often find that I can process experiences and sort out thinking when I'm moving my body, working with my hands, etc. It sounds like this wouldn't be called meditation per se because I'm not focused on the specific concrete activity I'm doing, like jogging, raking leaves, etc. Thoughts? Great question, Reverend Matt. This makes me, I feel an emotion of sadness because I wish we had even more time to talk about these great questions. But I would say the first thing about meditation is there's many different kinds of meditation. In a sense, all meditation is different cognitive and emotional techniques to help you be in the world the way you want to be in the world. With me, by the way, every day, 7 days a week. You know, 85% of my practice is mindfulness meditation. Probably another 5 to 7% is metta, loving kindness meditation. Little body scans, other stuff, visualization, that kind of thing, little mantra stuff. But, the key is you want to find a practice that works for you in the moment. So again, anything, I would say, Reverend Matt, anything can be a vehicle of meditation. And by the way, working with your body is great. Another book I highly recommend, and I recommend this to a lot of my patients too, is called The Body Keeps the Score. Incredible book that I have somewhere on my bookshelves, but it's by Bessel van der Kolk. But if you just Google The Body Keeps the Score, it's also on tape. That's good to have it in paper. They're both good. I'm realizing I have a lot of books on tape and paper. Anyway, The Body Keeps, it makes a very powerful argument, research-based, that we hold stress and trauma and even grief in our body physically. So for example, when someone experiences trauma, and we're in traumatic times right now with this pandemic, there's not just psychological reactions, fear, anxiety, stress, or we look at like peak experiences, wellness, positive psychology. It's not just the psychological, it's the neurological and the physiological in our body. When we experience trauma, and we're in traumatic times right now, as you all know, we have physiological reactions that are in our body that can. Ways to do that, as Reverend Matt brings up, is working in your body, raking leaves, gardening, yoga, Tai Chi Qigong, kickboxing, mixed martial arts, jogging, triathlons, whatever it is, being in your body. Kind of like a cancer patient flushes the toxins out of your body. Exercise, movement practices are flushing that trauma toxicity out of your body. So I would actually say that jogging, raking leaves is a form of meditation. Because, meditation is just a very generic catch-all terms for things you do to help you be skillful. So many good questions. Let's see. Chiara, I hope I'm pronouncing your name right. Forgive me. At the beginning, you read John Snyder. Yeah. Who are some other Buddhist poets that you recommend? Great. Well, I would say I highly recommend Thich Nhat Hanh. He writes a lot of very powerful poetry. I would recommend, he's deceased just a couple years ago, a South Austin Zen teacher and poet named John Snyder, and one of the most thoughtful Buddhists I ever knew. Very powerful man. I would recommend his poetry, and I would recommend Thich Nhat Hanh's poetry. Thich Nhat Hanh, we've already talked about him a little bit, but he did a lot of interfaith work, especially Buddhist-Christian dialogue, and he wrote a lot of really powerful poetry. I would actually recommend my friend John Snyder. Let's see. Oh, and then also someone recommended Clark. Thank you, Clark. Clark said under Matt's comment, Reverend Matt, Clark said, listen to Fran's Coffee with the pastor from this morning if you haven't already. I echo that. I haven't listened to Fran's Coffee yet, but Fran is a minister at Peace of Christ Church, and Peace of Christ Church does important work in the community. And they do good stuff like these podcasts all the time. I'm noticing Reverend Aurelia. We still have a minute or two. I want to be mindful of y'all. But I noticed Reverend Aurelia here quotes, or she mentions when death comes. Yeah, and you know what? I have, so a little personal sharing. I'm in my study and I have, I'm looking at the computer talking to y'all, but I have a wall of poems and stuff by Jane Hirschfield, Mary Oliver, Naomi Shihab Nye, William Stafford, Maya Angelou. Surround yourself with things that are skillful, my friends. And I don't see any more questions coming in. So I think I'll take some wisdom and I'm get a poem Aurelia likes. And the last thing I will say, definitely check out my friends at Peace of Christ Church. They do incredible stuff in the community. I'm learning from them all the time. If you like, feel free to check out my website. And I'm not saying that in some like marketing way or anything, but I really do try to make my website a free community resource. I have literally thousands of books on the integration of psychology, spirituality, Buddhism, different forms of mindfulness meditation, LGBTQ welcoming communities, only in Central Texas, but I hope to build that database out. I worked with a documentary filmmaker and made original videos of guided meditation. It's just my voice, but the documentary filmmaker, I'm certified in mindfulness-based stress reduction, and we shot these kind of MBSR-based videos. He got footage in California, in Galveston, kind of on the Gulf Coast of Texas, and then, my voice. But I have thousands of, I try to make it a free community resource. And I partner with Peace of Christ Church on the, online, and I partner with Peace of Christ Church all the time, and I do a lot of stuff in the community. I try to give psychology away for free. I also see a quote from Jana. Hey, Jana, it's so good to join us. I totally online stalk your website. Hey, stalk away. I try to make it a free community resource. And if you have resources you recommend, let me know. I'm always, there's a million forms of healing in the world. I'm always looking for them. So I want to be mindful of your time. Aurelia, you may be coming on too. But there's our friend Aurelia. What I might do is close with one of your poems. Is that cool, Aurelia?
One of my poems?
Well, one of your faves, Mary Oliver.
Oh, I was like, huh? Yes. So good.
Cool. And then did you want to say a word right as we wrap up too?
Yeah.
All right.
I'll just say really quickly to go to peacewilco.com/dig deep to register for our other webinars, the next 3 coming up. We hope you'll check those out. And also thank you again. I'm sure everyone's clapping on the other end. Thank you so much for doing this for us. And we will, as soon as you finish your poem, I'll just end I'll end the webinar. And so, yeah, just to say thank you now. So we can end.
Hey, Aurelia, you're the best. Thank you. And thanks to Fran, Reverend Matt, Reverend Fran, and everybody at your church. And just everybody who signed in, thanks for your time. Thanks for your ideas. Feel free, definitely check out Peace of Christ Church. They're amazing. I admire their work. And oh yeah, I should give my website, which is www.dr for Dr. David Zuniga, Z like zebra, Uniga. It's all one word, Dr. David Zuniga, all one word.com. If you just Google David Zuniga, however you try to spell my name, which is cool, Buddhism, it'll come right up. Psychology, it'll come right up. Thank you, everyone. All these kind words are coming up. And thank you for giving me the opportunity to be with you all. I learned just from being interconnected with you all. I really mean that. So I'm so grateful. Thank you, Aurelia. Thanks, Peace of Christ Church. And let's hear from our friend Mary Oliver. This was Aurelia's awesome suggestion. This is a poem called When Death Comes. When death comes, like the hungry bear in autumn, when death comes and takes all the bright coins from his purse to buy me and snaps his purse shut, when death comes like the measles pox, when death comes like an iceberg between the shoulder blades. I want to step through the door full of curiosity, wondering, what is it going to be like, that cottage of darkness? And therefore, I look upon everything as a brotherhood and a sisterhood, and I look upon time as no more than an idea, and I consider eternity as another possibility, and I think of each life as a flower, as common as a field daisy, and as singular, and each name a comfortable music in the mouth, tending, as all music does, towards silence. In each body, a lion of courage and something precious to the earth. When it's over, I want to say, all my life, I was a bride, married to amazement. I was a bridegroom, taking the world into my arms. When it's over, I don't want to wonder if I have made of my life something particular and real. I don't want to find myself sighing and frightened or full of argument. I don't want to end up simply having visited this world. Thank you, my friends. Be well. Be well.